Hello friends and welcome back to Luffy Fiction. How are you all? So in this video we will see part 3 of what if Luffy manifested the Dragonic place in hell. Now without any further delay let's continue the story. Melissa had mentioned it one time. That one language she'll only ever love. It's one that the tongue could never weave, one that boys her naive age back then could never understand unless they decided to learn it themselves, and one that has been passed on from sister to sister in her family for generations. Melissa had said that the language of flowers was a sacred thing to girls, because when girls had nothing back then, no education, no independency, no self-worth, no freedom, they had flowers. Flowers that would serve as messages disguised as pretty little things. Served as messages that required no pen to write with or knowledge to read with. Melissa would regale her with stories of her youth sometimes, if she was ever in the reminiscent mood. That back then she had been as pretty a lass as Makino is. That her now whitened hair had once been a blazing fiery red and her now tired eyes had once been full of life in a time now lost. That long ago, she had been courted by several eligible bachelors. She had even boasted about one of them being a noble from Hightown. Before, she had been gifted with love letters, poems, serenades, perfumes, dresses, and fancy jewelry. All of which she had denied, because she didn't know how to read back then, which had ruled out all the letters and poems, and none of the serenades were particularly enticing to the ears, and any materialistic objects that she had received were pawned off, and the money that she earned from that was used to build Party's bar. Yet, like any young lady with at least an ounce of love kept warmed in their hearts, she had eventually found the one. And it had been in a stubborn, silver-tongued, good-for-nothing marine lad that had only been nothing but good and sweet and irritatingly charming to her. It was a love that wasn't meant to be. One that would only bring sorrow and tragedy to both ends, yet the two of them allowed it to fester and grow to something that led to bittersweet hope. He had taught her many things whenever he'd stay, things that mattered so little to him but meant so much more to her. He taught her how to read, how to write, how to do math, and if it hadn't been for him then this bar would have probably been some rundown joint that had gone bankrupt ages ago. In turn, she taught him what she knew. To always have a handkerchief with him just in case because you never knew when you'd need one, to sew the holes that would suddenly appear in his uniform after a hard day at duty, and to keep his mother-beeping tongue in that goddamn mouth of his or she'd snip it off for Poseidon's sake. But, most importantly, she'd taught him her beloved language. And it had always made her day whenever he'd come running into the bar with either a single flower or a whole bouquet of it just for her. A reseda, which meant that he valued her qualities more than her charms. Red peonies to signify his unyielding devotion to her. Purple pansies surrounding a heart's ease to remind her that she would always be in his thoughts as he would hopefully be in hers. A justicia that had made her blush since it meant that she was the very epitome of a woman. The vines of the weeping willow wrapped around the stems of ash-leaved trumpet flowers, milkvetch and primroses to keep it held securely together, which held the meaning that their period of separation was one that he would always mourn for because without her, the pain inside of him wouldn't reside and it was something he couldn't live with if not for the reminder of her. They were all very lovely, Melissa had told her, wrinkly face soft and eyes brighter than usual, as she showed her one of the books where she kept the flowers pressed. When Luffy flipped to the last page, she saw a wilted hexagram-shaped flower pressed to the worn page. Melissa told her that it was a jonquil. A flower once as white as a bride's dress with small yellow clusters of blooms in the center. And it had meant that he desired a return of her affections. It had been the last flower he would give her, because a month after he should have returned, should have come back to her bar, where she would be waiting with a bouquet of garden daisies to give to him. A message had been sent from his family in far, far away West Blue. He had died, and his funeral had been held on a date 2 weeks before the letter had reached her. The letter detailed that he had died heroically in battle. That he had sacrificed himself for the lives of his men by facing against the enemy pirate crew to buy time for his own company to retreat to safer waters. And, most heartbreakingly, within the envelope the letter had been safely sealed within, there was a red rose. I cried for weeks, Melissa had said, tired eyes back once more. I cried for the moments that could have been if I had stopped hesitating, if I had grabbed that silly necktie of his and beeped him with everything I had, if I had said yes sooner, then maybe he would have thought about me before sacrificing his life for others, Melissa had murmured, her gaze strayed to the floor. There was no other men after him, Luffy. He had ruined me for others, because whenever some charming lad would try to woo me, I'd only ever see him in my eyes, and my heart had long stopped beating when his had perished. She had stayed silent the whole time as she listened to Melissa, knowing deep down what she must have felt. Unrequited love may be a drop of ink compared to tragic love, but the pain of what if was all the same. The weight of a hand on her head brought her back to reality, and she looked up at Melissa, who was wryly smiling at her. "Word of advice from an old lady like me," Melissa started. "Take a chance, Luffy, because you won't know when you'll regret it." She nodded wordlessly, her own gaze downcast as pessimism ate her up. What was there to take, when no one would give it? Beep. "Are you, okay?" Dogra asks her, fidgeting from where he's standing right near the window. With the way his gaze keeps flicking outside every so often, it looks as if he's about ready to bolt anytime soon. It doesn't help that Mamoru is looking at him with murder in his eyes, as if Dogra is the one at fault for Luffy's sudden terror. Which, technically, Dogra is just a part of. She looks at him with wide eyes. "Where's your boss and the kid?" she asks him in a hysterically high-pitched voice, her face a shade paler than it usually is. Dogra's eyes stare up at the ceiling in contemplation. Not sure about the kid, since he's usually off adventuring at this time of the day to who knows where, but the boss should be back from the Goa Kingdom tonight, he answers. "And the name of your boss?" she asks, even though deep down in her gut there's something dark and heavy that curdles hideously because she knows the answer to that, and it's so stupid of her to even ask. Yet, she can't help but hope that she won't have to beep things up anymore, because damn it, she's not ready yet. Dogra squints his dark eyes at her suspiciously. "Who's to say you won't sell out our location?" he asks her then. Wow. She can't help but be impressed, because that was some pretty good deducing. Still, she gives him a deadpanned look. "I'm a kid," she emphasizes whilst gesturing to her entire, obviously, kid-like body. "I don't even know where to sell your location." "Yeah, but still," Dogra stubbornly huffs, crossing his arms. "Did he just—" "Yeah, he did." Crossing her arms, she beeps a hip and gives him her best unimpressed stare. "Look, I don't know what I have to do to earn your trust, but the best thing I can do is a pinky swear. So you decide whether we shake pinkies or I leave you to deal with your friend," she offers, holding out her right pinky finger and hoping to any deity out there that he wouldn't slice it off with maybe that pickaxe that was suspended on the wall right there. And how the beep didn't she notice that? "Fine," Dogra decides, grimacing. After performing the ritual pinky swear complete with pressed thumbs, Dogra finally spits out the answer. "The boss's name is Curly Dayton," he says, chest puffing out. "And we are the Dayton family. The most notorious mountain bandits in all of East Blue," he announces proudly. "But there's only 4 of you," she says, dubiously regarding his claim. When Dogra suddenly grins darkly, she's quick to say, "I don't even want to know." "The rest are off on vacation," the mountain bandit says with a helpless shrug. "Yuha, sure. I'm Dogra, by the way, and the man you're treating is Magra." Dogra finally introduces himself, even though she's managed to pick that up by herself, but he doesn't need to know that, and she merely nods politely in turn. Now that she's thinking about it, she really should have recognized them. The two, while minor characters, had played a somewhat important role in ASL's origin story, and nobody could ever forget Dogra running back home to deliver the "oh no, guys, Sabo's dead" news, and that cringingly awful jumpsuit of his. But hey, she didn't have a single clue that she'd be reincarnated into this world as Luffy, so she never really bothered studying for the goddamn thing, and the Dayton family, especially the background characters, hadn't really been mentioned in what, 50 episodes? 100? A One Piece fan she may be, but she had been a physician first and foremost in her past life, so it had honestly been more expected from her to memorize every single thing about the human body than the entire detailed plotline and characters of One Piece. "If you don't mind me asking, Doc, but what's your name?" Dogra asks her. Oh yeah, where were her manners? "My name's Luffy," she introduces herself in turn, purposefully leaving out her last name and middle initial for all the trouble it would have caused if she'd mentioned it. "Huh. Weird name. Like yours isn't," she retorts, turning her back to him when it looks like he's about to pull out some witty remark from his ass. "Do you have any mortars and pestles? Or anything I can use to grind with? These herbs don't prepare themselves, you know," she immediately asks for, grinning to herself when she hears Dogra stop short from whatever he had to say. "I'll go get it," Dogra sighs in defeat before he scurries out of the room. Something narrow and furry wrapping itself around her wrist catches her attention, and she doesn't even have to check to know that Mamoru has wrapped his tail around it. She affectionately pats him on the head in reply. "You just wait, Mamoru. We'll be back home soon," she murmurs to him. Beep. A few hours later, when her fingers have been stained with the essence of several different herbs and her vision has started to grow a little blurry around the edges from what could be her lack of sleep, she is startled by the sudden slamming of a door, which is strong enough to shake the entire house. What the beep? She curses aloud, trying her very best to hold down the table. She's starting to regret letting Mamoru, her beautiful, beautiful bodyguard, off on his stroll in the forest where he is able to vent out his inner Hulk to unfortunate animals. Dogra. Well, she's not really sure, because it sounds like some kind of inhumane combination between a shriek and a roar. Something echoes throughout the entire house. Once she's half sure that another tremor won't disrupt her workplace, she hurries off to check on Magra, who's blearily opening both of his eyes. "BBB, Magra is stammering out, his voice gruff. "Hush, you," she tells him as she prepares a glass of cool water for him to drink. "It's none of your business now. Your job is to get some rest and to get ready for the journey tomorrow." She basically orders him as she helps him sit up and hands him the glass of water to drink. He drinks the whole glass, much to her relief and contentment. "Journey?" he asks her, blinking sleepily. She ushers him back into bed and helps him cover himself up with the layers of blankets. "We'll be going to my village tomorrow. There's a doctor there who'll be able to help you get better," she informs him, before pushing some blankets aside to get access to his bandaged arm. After checking his rash and replacing the chamomile leaves with a fresh batch, she wraps a new roll of bandages over his arm before discarding the used ones into an empty bucket right next to the vomit bucket. "Oh," Magra murmurs off, eyes drooping to a close every so often. Magra," her manages to stumble out. She gives him a small albeit amused smile for his efforts. "I know. And I'm Luffy, your temporary doctor," she introduces for the second time that day. "I have a monkey named Mamoru, but he's off on his own adventure right now, so you won't be able to see him until maybe tomorrow," she adds, in case that he might wake up one time to Mamoru peering creepily at him from the wooden supports on the ceiling. Magra nods sleepily, and she can tell he hadn't understood a single word she'd said, before he closes his eyes for sure this time and allows himself to be dragged back into sleep. She stands by the side of his bed for a few more minutes, checking on his pulse and changing the moist towel on his forehead for the 13th time for a colder one. Then she goes out of the room to check what was all that earlier commotion about. "Dogra." She calls out for the midget mountain bandit, wondering what has happened. "Dogra, are you still alive?" She calls out once more, this time in a much louder voice. She hears a response a moment of stillness later in the form of booming footsteps that most definitely do not belong to a man of Dogra's size. Whirling around, she positions her right foot back, remembering what basic martial arts stances she remembers from those crappy TV shows she used to watch during her woe is me sessions in her apartment. The first thing she sees is a very wide waist squishing against a leather brown belt that would have looked amazing on this one dress she had in her past life. She drags her gaze upward, and meets the gaze of who could undeniably be Curly Dayton, whose infamous mane of orange hair starts of his tight dreads at the scalp then flows freely into a low ponytail of messy curls from the nape and then on. "Who the hell are you?" Dayton snarls, teeth bared at her, which emphasizes just how dark her lips are from years of smoking and not just some shade of lipstick. "I'm Luffy," she answers, forcing herself to grin as beep powers up her train of thoughts. Dayton narrows her eyes at her. "I wasn't asking for your shitty name. I wanted to know who are you and what the hell are you doing in my house?" Dayton demands, bending over by the waist to pick her up by the scruff of her shirt. The fabric of her shirt digs painfully into her armpits, and she has to hold herself up with the use of Dayton's meaty fingers to prevent herself from slipping out of her shirt and showing her flat tits. Damn it. She knew she shouldn't have let Mamoru wander off. "I'm here to help Magra," she says through clenched teeth, forced grin still on her face. She reins in her temper, thinking rationally that it certainly wouldn't do to piss off a mountain bandit boss who could easily chop her head with a single swing of an axe. "Huh?" Dayton exclaims loudly, glaring at her with an incredulous expression on her face. "But you're just a tiny brat," Dayton yells as she shakes her roughly. It's the truth," she yells back, clenching tighter to Dayton's fingers as stars begin to appear in her vision. Fortunately for her, Dogra appears and she's never been so thankful to see his awful fashion sense. "Be boss." The midget bandit cries out, before he latches himself to Dayton's leg and starts tugging on her belt to stop her from continuously shaking Luffy. "Don't hurt her. She's the doctor that I was telling you about earlier," he pleads loudly. "Huh?" Dayton exclaims once more. "This brat is supposed to be the damn doctor? But she's a brat." Dayton emphasizes her words by giving her a rough shake. "But she's a smart brat," Dogra informs his boss, "and she knows what she's doing. She knows how to help Mogra, boss." "How many beeping times do I have to tell you, Dogra?" Dayton practically screams, and there is a wrathful kind of fire that burns darkly in her eyes that makes her shrink back in fear. "Mogra's a lost cause. There's nothing we can do for him. He's dead meat. You hear me? I've seen plenty of our men die from the same kind of shit he's caught, and I'm sure as hell he won't be the first to live through it," she hurls out of her powerful lungs. "So don't get your hopes up when some doctor finally agrees to help and say that they know what's wrong when in fact they can't even do anything and are just fooling you for the belly, you idiotic fool." The silence that takes place afterwards would have been nearly deafening if not for Dayton's heavy panting. "God beeping damn it," Dayton wheezes out as she lets go of her to place a shaky hand on her heaving chest. She plops onto the ground with a heavy thump, landing first on her bum. It's a painful fall, but the physical pain is nothing compared to the emotional turmoil that makes it feel as if her heart is about to burst with everything that has pained her when people doubted her. She wishes she had the straw hat. She wishes that she had any hat, because she's sure that the look in her eyes is just as ugly as the way Dogra's face has tearfully scrunched up. "It's true that I can't do anything," she says as she breathes out, and already she can feel the intent gazes on her from both mountain bandits. "I'm just a brat, like you've said, and I don't really have anything that can cure Mogra of his disease." She pauses for a moment to take in a deep breath as well as to mentally prepare herself for the explanation she's about to give. "But the two of you have to understand what Mogra's suffering from right now. Your friend is undergoing a disease called, from what I've learned, dengue, and it is a fast-spreading viral disease that can kill within the duration of either a week or, unfortunately, an entire month if not treated properly. I'm guessing that Mogra's illness started when a mosquito carrying the dengue virus had infected him, which is the most likely conclusion since tropical areas such as this forest are usually a common breeding ground for mosquitoes, and I hardly doubt that at least one of them isn't carrying a virus. Dogra has already informed me of Mogra's symptoms that has appeared over the past week: high fever, migraines, stabbing pain behind the eyes, severe muscle pain, nausea, nosebleeds, rashes and vomiting, which he has done 4 times for the past 5 hours, and it all alarmingly points out that he has dengue. Usually, dengue would be combated by keeping the patient fully rested and hydrated, however, she licks her dry lips. I've noticed that Mogra has been taking too much rest and not enough water, which is why he hasn't gotten better. Another reason could be that this is not his first time catching dengue, which would be incredibly worrisome because it might mean he has dengue hemorrhagic fever, and that is much worse than the average dengue because it could lead to the enlargement of the liver, failure of the circulatory system, massive bleeding, then most likely death. She trails off. I'm concerned that he already has hemorrhagic fever because he's been vomiting, bleeding through the noise and experiencing joint pains, yet that could also be because of dehydration, but we'll see once he gets his blood checked and a dextrose in his wrist. She starts, to Dayton and Dogra's point of view, rambling out a bunch of confusing and complicated terms for a few more minutes until the mountain bandit boss interrupts her. "Okay, we beeping get it," Dayton grumbles as she massages her aching temple. "He has this dengue, maybe hemo something fever, so what do we do about it?" she demands, but in a softer and less intimidating voice. She stares for a good and long moment. "Breathe, Luffy," she tells herself. If there is one thing she doesn't really miss about being doctor, it is the redundancy and weariness of having to explain to anybody without any knowledge of first aid or medicine what is going on. Beeping, breathe and don't explode, she reminds herself once more. She emphasizes. "We'll bring Mogra to Fuchsia village tomorrow," she ends curtly. "FF Fuchsia?" both bandits exclaim. "Are you insane?" Dogra cries out, holding his head in both hands. "That's where Garp lives. He'll kill us then lock us up in hell if he sees us there. He looks close to actually crying as he shudders at the imagination of Garp grinning evilly down at him. She actually feels pretty bad, because if only these bandits knew how much of a beeping marshmallow her grandpa could be. He won't, she says offhandedly. We're on pretty good terms, so I'm sure I'll be able to talk him out of imprisoning you. She grins brightly after that, and it's not like the one she'd forced on a while ago. Besides, there's a doctor in Fuchsia Village who I'm sure will be able to help Magra more than I can, and he's the only one I know on Dawn Island who will most likely help you, she adds as she wonders what would Kokoi's reaction be once he sees the mountain bandits she's brought back to his clinic. And how much would your friend charge? Dayton inquires, peering suspiciously at her. She clenches her fists and it takes a lot of her willpower to keep them glued to her sides. Her grin transforms into a bland smile, before she answers with utmost professionalism. I'm sure you'll find his price range to be accommodatingly low, she says in a steady voice, swallowing down any insults that threateningly creep up her throat. But it's your decision. Whether you'll condemn Magra to a slow and painful death or not. Just know that I'll be waiting for your answer tomorrow morning, she finishes before turning on her heel and making her way back to Magra's room to steam off. Beep. A few more hours later, when the yelling and hushed whispering from outside of the room finally quiet down, and the ugly sensation swirling right next to her heart has disappeared, she sets down whatever she's holding and admits to herself that she hasn't really accomplished anything. What do I do? She murmurs to herself, sighing heavily through her nose afterwards. The idea, more like problem, of going back to Fuchsia weighs heavily upon her conscience as the sky has on Atlas's shoulders. She still doesn't know what to do, has no idea what to say when the time comes and somebody asks, "Where have you been? How are you still alive? How do you know all of this?" She knows she can't just wing it. You don't do that when the situation is serious and you have no answer for why. She's scared, she knows that. In a common moment of self-doubt, she wonders why had she been reincarnated as Luffy. She's the farthest thing from the man who's destined to become Pirate King, an ant compared to the greatness that he had been, will be. He's strong, charismatic, funny, honest, courageous, and willing to die for anybody he calls his own. She's nothing like him. Nothing, she can hardly hold her own against a 200-pound tiger. Smile as bright, or as menacing, as a monkey is known for, make a joke to even save her life, say the goddamn truth to those who deserve it, muster up the balls to be honest, and she is willing to die for those who call her own. If she hadn't been, then she wouldn't be in this stupid forest having a stupid reflection of her stupid worth in this stupid life. So what if she shares just one trait with him? It still doesn't change anything. She is not Monkey D. Luffy, and she suspects that she never will be. She's known too much, lived too long, to be the free-spirited boy she loves when the burden of the world is visible upon her shoulders. Once upon a time, there was a young boy who dared to dream. Once upon a time, there was a young girl who dared to open a manga named One Piece. And it's with that knowledge that she is afraid. The boy grew up into a young man who challenged the very world itself for those he called friend and brother. The girl grew into a young woman who cowed from those who could have been. Because people will die, she knows who, have read and watched with a tightness in her throat, and what makes her most afraid is that she has the choice to do something about it. To change things, but for the better or worse she knows not. And I don't know what to do, she whispers to herself, and she finds herself sitting down on the floor from the very weight of her words. It has always been like this for her. Never knowing what to do with herself because she was always afraid of the consequences, of the repercussions that she would have to face if she started going after luxuries than necessities. Once upon a time, there was a young man who chased after freedom, never fearing and never backing down. Once upon a time, there was a young woman who allowed herself to be dragged into a cage, always fearing and never standing up. Knock. Knock. She immediately freezes up, the bottom of her palms staying glued to her eyelids. A moment passes. Knock. Knock. Slowly, she lets her arms fall to her sides. Slowly, she gets up from where she's sitting pitifully on the floor. Knock. 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 The knocking grows impatient, but that's enough to motivate her limbs to move just a little bit faster. Sorry, she squeaks, her voice unnaturally high-pitched that makes even her wince. Her hand grabs onto the brass doorknob, twists it, and wrenches the door open. I was doing something. She falls short, however, when she sees who's been on the other side of the door. Hint. It's not Dogra or Dayton at the door. Instead, a young boy stands in front of her with probably the meanest expression she's ever seen on a child as young as he, and instantly she knows who he is. She would have slammed the door right in his face. She's not kidding. She really would have, and probably would have broken his nose in the process. But she's too stunned to even breathe. "Who are you, Ace? Goddamn Ace," asks her after a beat of silence, his eyebrows digging a deeper furrow over the top of the bridge of his nose, and he glares at her with such intensity that doesn't look right on a boy his age. How old is he? She mentally wonders as she swallows down the imaginary lump that has accumulated in her throat. "I'm Luffy," she supplies. Judging by how his lips twist into a scowl, he isn't all that pleased with her answer. "I don't care what your name is," he spits out. What a rude little piece of shit, she can't help but think as she flinches because wow, she knew he was rude, but really. That was just enough douchiness to rival a grown man's. Still, she keeps the words in her mouth by thinning her lips. "Where's the doctor?" Ace asks, but it sounds like more of a demand than anything else, as he bodily pushes her out of his way and walks into the room. She rams shoulder first into the frame of door, and she cringes at the pain that shoots up from the bruises that had already formed there from her stay in the jungle. "Okay. Ouch," she starts off, pushing herself away from the door frame as she rubs the bruises in her shoulder that she just knows are darkening in color. "And 2, I'm the doctor," she informs him as she crosses her arms and beeps her hip. His reaction is comical, and what makes it even funnier is that it's an exact replica of the one he'd made in the anime. His eyes widened and lips puckered out to an unnatural length and all. "Huh," he exclaims, disbelief written all over his face. "You're the doctor." She can't help smiling in amusement because she can't really blame him. Even she wouldn't believe that she was a doctor if she was in his place, no matter how annoying it was that this was everyone's reaction to her not anymore profession. "Yep," she pops out as she makes her way back to her little table of herbs. She eyes the little vial of extracted hawthorn berry juice, wondering if she should have picked a couple more berries if all she would get was this tiny amount. A plate being loudly placed on top of her pretty, little, and incredibly precious lobelia flowers catches her attention, and she's quick to grab the plate up before any damage has been done. "Hey," she cries out as she sets down the plate on a spot that's safely cleared of anything important. She blinks, however, when she sees a large and roasted pork cutlet sitting innocently on the plate. "Is this his blood?" Ace questions as he holds up the vial of hawthorn juice and peers into with a kind of fascination typical to rowdy boys his age. She can't help the bark of laughter that escapes her. "It's juice," she informs him, and watches as his cherub cheeks flash a pretty shade of red. "I knew that," Ace growls as he none too gently places the vial on the table. She barely hears him, her attention solely focused on his most attractive trait. "Oh," she says, a tad bit breathless and making her sound like one of those old ladies just creeping in the hallways and waiting for the perfect chance to attack innocent, chubby-cheeked kids. "You have such lovely freckles." She can't help smiling because it's been so long since she's seen a child. An adorable, scowling child, which is one of the best, even though said child is a huge part of future events that will rock the entire world. His cheeks flush a deeper shade of red and suddenly, as she observes him with bright eyes, she starts to forget. Forgets the what-ifs and consequences. Forgets the future and the damn plot. Forgets the pirate with fire in his fists and sees only a boy with the meanest expression she's ever seen. She sees only Ace, and her heart cracks a little because no kid should live like this, shrouded in insecurities and responsibilities too old for him. And she hates herself a little for thinking that it would be better off leaving things as it is. Because leaving him, leaving a boy so lonely and so lost for another half-decade to fester in his own self-hatred. How could she start changing things when she couldn't even do it now? Because if now wasn't the time, then when would it ever be? She thinks of the children like him, of the people, not characters, who are children in the present. She thinks of Sabo running away from a home that has never felt like one. Of Zoro training himself to the ground for the promise shared with a dead friend. Of Nami weeping miserably as she grafts down map after map for a pirate gone mad. Of Usopp screaming out lies every single day to tuck in the hurt in his heart. Of Sanji wondering what was so wrong with himself to deserve the scorn of his blood relatives. Of Vivi and Chopper and so many more that could have been happy. She thinks of her nephew and wonders how he is right now. Is he eating right? Did he make any new friends at school? Is her sister treating him right? And she sees the answers to her questions in a boy so lonely and lost. Shut up. Ace growls out as menacing as a baby monkey, meaning that it's far cuter than it is as scary. Ace makes a move to get out of the room as quickly as he can. Surprisingly, she moves quicker than him. Wait, she's squeaking out right after her hand has clamped down on his lower arm with enough strength to actually make him pause. Wait, she says in a much softer voice as beep, beep, beep dances like some kind of tribe across her mind. Okay, she did not plan this one out. What? Ace says bluntly as he turns to face her, face just a lighter shade of red as he stares down at her incredulously. His arm stays in her grip, but judging by the way the muscles there twitch, she's safe to assume that he's about ready to pull it back any second now. Could you stay? She blurts out, and oh gosh, that was just bad. Bad enough to land in her top 10 worst word vomits ever. I mean, it gets kinda lonely here with nobody but myself and Magra over there, but even he's no good cause he's kinda knocked out, and I'm just really bored and could use somebody to talk to, but you don't have to if you don't want to unless you want to, and that's perfectly fine for me. Oh god, her brain-to-mouth filter just abandoned her. Ace just stares at her. He stares at her for quite a long time that it's starting to unnerve her just a little bit. She expects him to say no, hopes just a little bit that he'll say no just for her to salvage what little dignity she has left. She lets go of his arm. The sudden action seems to have snapped him out of whatever doozy he's probably been thinking about because he blinks. He stares at her for a little longer, and as he's scrutinizing her. Finally, after a terribly awkward long while, he slowly nods his head as if even he isn't sure with what he's agreeing to. Sure, he says, sounding just the exact opposite. And she internally bemoans her entire existence because why did she just have to have such a beeping soft spot for children? Externally, she gives him a little crooked smile as she thanks him. Beep. Ace, despite his glares and scowls and utter rudeness, is still a child. A little socially stunted, but still a child nonetheless. Like every child out there, he is naturally curious about things he has no knowledge of and does not hesitate to ask. She finds it truly refreshing to have him as company, because it's been quite a long, and traumatizing, time since she's been treated as an equal instead of as a kid who knows nothing about the world, so she answers his question without so much as a hesitant or doubtful thought. His questions are simple enough. What is that? What does it do? Where did you get that? But he eventually brings out the big guns when there's no more herbs to talk about. Where did you learn all this? Ace asks her, his gaze straying from the leaflet he'd been fiddling with to meet her own. Her hands go very still from where they're hovering above her precious Arjuna bark, and there's a sudden tightness in her throat. Just read a lot, she answers, and it's not a lie nor is it the complete truth. Ace raises a single eyebrow as he eyes her speculatively and suspiciously. And you learned all this by reading? He scoffs, not believing her in the slightest. She frowns. Don't underestimate books, she scolds him, withholding the after all, you are. In one that creeps up her throat. You can learn a lot from just opening one. Books are useless, Ace bluntly retorts. They're boring and the only use they have is for hitting stupid people's heads with them. Her frown deepens, and she feels her temper rising just a little bit because her object of affection is being directly insulted. They're not useless, she insists. They're a way to pass down knowledge from one person to another, especially if the one who'd written it was dead and wanted their words to last forever. Books are there to help inspire you, to help you gain a wider understanding of everything around you, and it helps you improve yourself. They're there to help you learn from others' mistakes, to help you learn from your own, and I'm rambling again, aren't I? She laughs a little, her cheeks flushing a bit from embarrassment. Ace just stares at her. He's been doing that a lot, she notices, before he blinks and shrugs. You talk a lot, he comments, both of his eyebrows rising up as if he's just realized this. I do, she agrees. Even in her past life, She's been known as a chatterbox, which is probably what's annoyed others because they usually didn't understand what she was talking about or they just weren't all that interested. But I find that it helps drown out the silence sometimes. She forlornly smiles as she looks down at the Arjuna bark. She misses the way Ace looks back down at the leaflet in his hand, fiddling with it for no apparent reason. How old are you, anyways? Ace asks out of the blue after several minutes of complete silence. Huh, she says not too intelligently. She'd been caught off guard that the older boy had even bothered to start up the conversation, so forgive her if her wits have momentarily vanished. Oh, I'm 2, she answers with a small smile as she watches his reaction. His eyes bulge out to the size of dinner platters, just like Poppy's, she thinks with a fond smile. 2, he splutters out in a loud voice. You're lying. I'm only 5 but you already, he mumbles out the rest of his words. She tilts her head, but I already, she trails off as she catalogues the fact that Ace is 5 years old. I'm sorry, but I didn't quite catch that. Ace's cheeks flush a light shade of red, and she can't help but be drawn to his adorable freckles. But you already know so much, he confesses, childishly puffing his cheeks out, and oh god he's pouting. Ace is pouting. You're unfairly adorable and I just want to hide you underneath a big old rock so that no one can hurt you, is what she refrains from saying. Oh, she says, sounding just as surprised as she feels. A smile curls her lips, and she can't help but be a little mischievous. Well, I'm an old soul, after all, she jokes even though it is hilariously true. That sounded like a ridiculously good epithet. Old soul Luffy, huh. But I only know these things because I read a lot. But put me in a fight and you'll see that I'm as good as a headless chicken, she laughs as she remembers her fight against the humongous tiger. She is an incompetent fighter, and she needs to change that. You don't know how to fight? Ace asks her with wide eyes. How did you get here then? You should be dead by now, he exclaims. She winces. A bit of luck, I guess. She muses. But Dogra found me earlier this morning and led me here to help Mogra, she explains to him. And you were alone this whole time? Ace continues asks her. Not really, she denies. I had Mamoru with me. He's a monkey who saved me a few days ago from being eaten alive by a snake, she informs him. A monkey, Ace states with blank features. Yes, she confirms with a nod. Just a monkey, he asks incredulously. Well, he has a bit of a, she struggles to find the child-friendly synonym for breathplay kink. An addiction to squeezing the life out of poor animals who gets in his way. But he's still a monkey. Ace stares at her, a look of absolute mystification stretched upon his features, or maybe he's just wearing his, I think you're a reckless idiot, look. Don't you have anybody to look out for you? He asks. Oh, I do, she answers as she smiles fondly at the memories of her time spent with her babysitters. All the adults in my village practically raised me as their own. What about your parents? Ace asks suddenly, and that, she's not prepared for. At that particular question, she averts her gaze from his own and finds that the hole in the floor is much more interesting than the boy in front of her. That's a hard question, she admits as she drags her tongue across her lower lip, suddenly at a loss for any other words. The memories she has of her parents stay as fresh on her mind as if it had only been yesterday since she'd seen them, contrary to the agonizingly long 14 months she's spent separated from them. The brilliance of her mother's bright eyes and her father's broad grin have been and always will be imprinted in her mind like some kind of branding mark that can never be surgically removed. Just like the memories of how she died. Are they dead? Ace blurts out, bluntly and insensitively. She flinches at his unkind words. You don't ask people that, she scolds him in a weak voice, and she mentally applauds herself for managing to find it in herself to correct his lack of manners. Ace doesn't apologize. She doesn't expect him to, but he does look shamefully down on the ground, and it's enough for her that at least he knows that what he'd done hadn't been appropriate. Nevertheless, she answers question because it feels wrong not to divulge any kind of information about herself when she knows so much about him. I don't know about my mother, but I at least know my father's alive, she tells him, her voice hollow. I haven't seen him since he gave me away when I was really young though, she adds, feeling her chest tighten as she remembers just how much she misses both of her parents. He gave you away, Ace asks her, and though the question is a tad bit insensitive, she can't find it in herself to scold him because of the look on his face that expresses his opinion on the topic. It seems like Ace's hatred for incompetent fathers extends past his own biological one. He had to, she corrects. He gave me away to protect me, because there were people after him and they would have, she trails off, hoping that Ace understood the gist of it. They would have you hunted down, Ace finishes, and his eyes are just so wide as his skin tone becomes a few shades lighter. She exhales deeply and nods curtly, too wordless and timid to say anything regarding the topic. And then, just when she's thought that they're finally done with the hard questions, Ace brings out the question that she knows all too well from keeping up with the series. "Do you know Goldie Roger?" he asks her, his eyebrows furrowed deeply and his lips set into a thin, firm line. He looks determined. And she realizes that he's determined to know her opinion about his father, and most likely what she has to say about him, the supposed devil's spawn. She stares at him for a good long while, watches him stare back at her with twice more intensity, and nods her head. "I know he's the Pirate King," she answers, and she knows her answer displeases him when his lips curve downwards at the typical description of his biological father. "But, from what I've gathered, he was a man worth admiration," she tells Ace slowly, gauging his reaction. His frown lets up, but he doesn't smile. Instead, he continues to stare intensely at her. "I'd hear stories about him. Some were bad, while others were good, but I never believed anything that had come out of those who didn't know the king himself," she continues, recalling from one of her One Piece binges how people who were and weren't close to the Pirate King viewed him. Those who were close to Roger said that he was fearless and loyal to those he called his. That he would never run away from a single battle. That he was greedy, but not for wealth, fame, or power. Would you believe it? He was greedy for freedom. She laughs, missing the way Ace frowns a bit, thinking that she was mocking his father, when in fact she felt a little hysterical at the mere mention of what she'd been lacking in her old life. Freedom. Such an intangible thing that hardly anybody notices because they're so used to their lives that they don't know what's wrong with theirs and everybody else's. She spits bitterly, suddenly spiteful, but she can hardly blame herself when she remembers the feeling of being suffocated from ideals that others would force onto her in her old life. She grips the edge of the table as she closes her eyes. She counts to 7 as she breathes in deeply, and counts another 7 as she exhales deeply. When she's calmed down, she continues on. "And that's why I admire him," she confesses in a soft voice. "Because he sought after what was so lacking in this world. Roger sought after freedom, and became its symbol. Goldie Roger was an amazing man, and that's all I can say," she says. And it's a lie. It's a big, fat, beeping lie because she has more to tell Ace about his father. How Roger had been dying on that execution stand yet still managed to turn that small, flickering flame left inside of him into a blaze that managed to envelope the entire world and set ships sailing far and wide throughout the seas and made people dream once more. How Roger had thought about him whilst he'd been imprisoned, knowing deep inside that he'd die before he'd ever get to see or hold his son. About Rouge, his mother, and her unconditional love for him that eventually brought her to her deathbed. But Ace doesn't look like he wants to hear more. In fact, it looks like he can hardly process her words. Words that talked of his father in a good light for what was probably the first time. "And if he had a child, do you think it deserves to live?" Ace asks her in a quiet, nearly silent voice, and his shoulders tremble from how tense he's been clipping his arms to his sides. Her gaze softens, and, unsurely, she reaches out for him. Ace flinches away from her touch, and when he looks up, his gaze is nothing short of all the pent-up rage and utter hurt that has been storing up inside of him after every single insult he's heard about him and his father. And that makes her so sad and angry at what this young boy had to go through. She meets his eyes, a fiery determination inside of her, and when her mouth opens, she lets all of the words that she wants to say to him out. "Everybody deserves to live," she says, and she sounds like she's ready to declare war against anybody who says otherwise. If the Pirate King had a child, then he has as much as right as anybody else does to live. Nobody has the right to say that child deserves death, because unless that child has done anything that Pirate King is supposedly famed for, then they have no right to label an innocent child for the crimes of his parent. She proclaims firmly, strongly, and never once avoiding his gaze to make sure that he understands that it's not his fault. Ace holds her gaze for a moment that feels like infinity itself before he breaks it and looks off to the side. You think so. It's soft and barely audible, but she hears it loud and clear. Even as he flinches away from her touch once more, she's adamant in grasping his shoulders so that they're completely face to face, and his gaze alarmingly shoots back to meet her own. Everybody who thinks a kid deserves to die is stupid, she says bluntly, in case he needed it hammered into his head. And people who actually say that are twice as stupid and are just plain rude and deserve a good beating to the head. Her heart flutters with joy when she sees Ace crack his first smile of the night, and she feels that she has finally done something good in this life. She's always told herself that she never really liked being a doctor, that the only reason she even became one in the first place was to appease her parents' nagging for her to decide what she would do with her life. She's a liar. She's always known that. She's lied to those she hates, to those she barely knows, and to those she even loves. She's even lied to herself, and she wonders how long has she been trying to keep up such a tirade. It's unhealthy, it's sick, it's wrong. She is the anomaly in a world that has never been hers. That black smudge of ink on paper that disrupts everything. It has never been the outcome that she's hated, but the process itself that has been the cause of her suffering and difficulty to break down the divide that has suddenly sprung up and thickened over the years between herself and those she called peers and family and friends. Medicine had been hard, that she can admit, and medical school had been just as difficult if not more so. They hand you a multitude of information: anatomy, biochemistry, bioethics, cell biology, embryology, epidemiology, genetics, hematology, histology, microbiology, neuroscience, physiology, public health, oncology, osteopathic manual medicine, osteopathic manual treatment, physiology, clinical medicine, geriatrics, pathology, pharmacology, pediatrics, physical diagnosis, psychiatry, and dear God, don't even get her started with those beeping clerkships. 2 months' worth rotations each for family medicine, geriatric, internal medicine, OB/GYN, pediatric, psychiatry, and surgery. And they expect you to have it all perfectly memorized and mastered in such little time, and if you can't manage it all, then you'll either be told to improve or to quit early on. It also didn't help that the system itself encouraged an unhealthy amount of competition, which would stay even after graduation, causing several arguments between physicians over whose method was better and more ideal for treatment. Frankly, it was just like high school all over again. Only difference was that everybody was much more intelligent, the backstabbing was much more subtle, and the grading system was objective and full of BS. But if there was any good trait that she had in herself, it was that she was persistent, and that persistency of hers had helped her claw her way out from the very bottom of the system to passing the bar exam with top marks. Sure, her love life and social life had suffered from it, but hey, she never really had a stable one in the first place, and her family life hadn't been as tense or suffocating as it once was, so all was well and good in her world. Besides, although her relationship with her coworkers were strained at best, she had honestly enjoyed her job as a physician, what with the adorable children she'd gotten to meet and play around with, the elderly who were fond of gifting her a few luxurious items, and the occasional asshole who thought that they knew more than her and she was pushed to call security to get them the hell out of her office when they got a little bit too violent with their words. And she'd been tired, which isn't really anything new. She's always been tired. From staying up late at night because of either her never-ending studies or surgical duties, or maybe the occasional fanfiction/good erotica, to the problems in her life and when the beep will her neighbor's dog stop being so beeping territorial so that she can finally get a beeping pet of her own to mope around with. She has always been tired. Tired of being such a utter disappointment in herself, most of all. And she wants to be free. She wants to think freely, talk freely, and act freely without having to worry about the consequences. And she can, she knows that. Why else would she be given another life, if not for a second chance? If not to right out the wrong in this world? If not to create chaos in a seemingly orderly world? If not to live before she starts dying once more? So she tells herself in that large shack of a house. I love being a doctor. After a moment, I miss being a doctor. Baby steps, she tells herself, because if she can be honest with Ace, then she can be honest with herself too. Live free, she adds. No more lies. Just silence and carefully worded responses from now on. Honest. Beep. The sun rises beautifully above the treetops from where she's gazing dreamily at from the window. There are dark bags underneath her eyes. Correction, She's more of staring blankly at whatever space there is than gazing dreamily like some kind of princess locked up in a high tower. She hasn't gotten a wink of sleep last night, having gotten too adrenalized with her meeting with Ace. Her head has been racked full of scenarios of the future she might have just done and beeped up. But hey, no use crying over spilt milk, right? So she's been too plagued with horrible wonderings to even close her eyes and succumb to sweet, peaceful sleep. The only good thing that has come from her not getting any sleep is that she's managed to properly prepare all of her herbs, reduced some into their powdered substances, and crammed all of them into their own special bottle and stuffed them into her bag. She notices for the umpteenth time that the sun's rays reflect off of the mirror in a corner adjacent to the window, but she doesn't dare turn around to see what she looks like. She can already guess what kind of smelly, haggard monster she looks like right now. Holes in her clothes, hair unbrushed, and bloodstains that have stubbornly stayed on even after having dealt with the furious scrubbing of her thumb and saliva. It's a good thing that she smells like several different herbs, lest she had already tossed herself into a nearby creek from the ungodly, natural smell that must be coming from her. She sighs, wondering where on earth could Mamoru be. Her companion hasn't once dropped by since he'd left, and she wonders if he'd gone back to his little family once he deemed it safe enough to leave her here with her kind. She snorts, because with the way he'd been eyeing Dagra, she doubts the monkey holds any kind of goodwill to the midget bandit. The sound of a door slamming shut loudly breaks her out of her inane musings. Judging by the tremors she'd felt from the wood underneath her arms, she guesses with a high probability that it must have been the front door that has probably earned another crack in its body. Curious, she peers down and sees a small figure with a mop of black hair swaggering. Wow. Just where the hell did this kid get his mojo? Towards the forest with a pipe at least twice his height in his hand. It is undoubtedly Ace of the infamous freckled cheeks. She rests her cheek in the palm of her hand as she gazes forlornly at the older, younger child. She hopes that her words had been taken seriously by him, and that she hadn't completely weirded him out with her straightforwardness and too deep words. Just as he's about to disappear for good into the forest, he stops. She perks up, both of her eyebrows rising up, and she wonders what has captured his attention this time. She watches as Ace turns around, lifts his chin, and meets her gaze with his own, and both of their eyes widen comically. For a short while, the both of them are stunned to see that they have the other's attention, and they stay frozen from where they are, not really knowing what to do. Tentatively, she raises an arm and waves at him in greeting. She can't determine what facial expression he's wearing this time. Is it the passive-aggressive one or the disapproving-aggressive one? From her distance, but her spirits curl up into a miserable ball to sulk in a corner of her heart when all Ace does in response is to turn around and disappear into the thick bushes of the forest without so much as a peep. Wow. Just. Wow. What? A beeping. Prick. With her cheeks burning in embarrassment, she turns away from the window and decides that checking on Magra's condition would be much more beneficial than looking out the window. I'll beat some manners into that beeping stubborn ass next time I see him, she grumbles heatedly before she busies herself with replacing Magra's bandages with a fresh batch. The door to the room creaks open, and she breathes out a sigh of relief when she turns around and sees that it's only Dagra with a plate of meat and a pitcher of fresh water. I bring breakfast. Dagra grins roguishly as he slams the door shut with his foot. Finally, she replies playfully, rolling her eyes. I thought I had to eat Magra to let you mountain bandits know how to feed your guests. Sorry, but ya see. He pauses once his gaze lands on the empty dinner plate sitting in the center of the table. Did you eat already? He asks her, looking bewildered. Not yet, she answers, shaking her head. Oh, Ace brought me something to eat last night, she informs him, just in case he'd thought she was tricking him. Ace brought you something to eat last night, Dagra intones blandly, staring blankly at the plate then at her. He brought you something to eat. He sounds like he hardly believes the words coming out of his mouth. Justifiably so, because even she hardly believes that Ace of all people had brought her food too. Yeah, he did, she says, even as she thinks, I know right. Kid nearly gave me a heart attack. Most polite boy I've ever met, she remarks sarcastically. Dagra grins. You tell me, he laughs. Though I'm not surprised he dropped by to check up on Magra. Out of all of us here, his favorite has always been Magra 'cause the bloke would always give his leftovers to the kid, he tells her, proving her guess that the only reason Ace even came to this room in the first place was because he had been worried about Magra. What a cinnamon roll, that kid. He didn't have to bring me food though, she remarks, trying to sound casual, and she knows that she's failed when Dogra gives her the no bullshit look. Maybe he was feeling nice, he shrugs as he sets down the plate of food on the table. Ever since he became moody, nobody here knows what goes on in that demon's head these days. She frowns a little at Dogra's nickname for Ace. Don't call him that, she lightly rebukes him. What? Demon? Huh? You should have seen him when he was 2 and he nearly set the house on fire, that one. Dogra laughs, and there's nothing but fondness in his voice. That little kid's a demon, believe me. Her frown deepens a little at Dogra's insistence and insensitiveness to Ace, but she can hardly blame him. Does the mountain bandit even know that Ace knows of his heritage? That he can hear all those whispers behind his back of his demonic lineage? Does he even know how aware Ace is for a 5-year-old child? So she gives him a tired glare before focusing on food. Because food is good. And food is food. And like any monkey raised right, she knows that food is not to be forsaken or ignored. She's already committed a grave sin for placing Ace before food last night, so it would be detrimental to her family's honor if she would violate their most sacred law once more. She listens to him ramble as she devours her meal. She wishes they'd give her more. She's a growing girl after all, and the monkey's infamous metabolism isn't something to be looked down upon. But she isn't hungry to the point of where her stomach is growling anymore, and she isn't as gluttonous as her male counterpart, so she is half content with what lays in her stomach. Boss said yes, Dogra blurts out of the blue, and her brain immediately processes it for her to understand what he meant. Oh. Her first reaction is blank. Oh. She makes up for it by brightening up with the force of a million suns. That's great. We can leave as soon as you guys are ready. She beams happily at him, glad that she'd managed to make them see things her way, and mentally filing a reminder to herself to apologize to Dayton for her rudeness yesterday. Beep. They don't leave that day. In fact, none of the mountain bandits ever get ready. Because trouble is here, and it comes in the form of only one being that is capable of sending a foreboding sense of dread into everybody's guts. It comes in the horrendous form of Monkey D. Garp. She had been browsing through the pages she'd ripped off of Koko's books, despairing over the vandalism she had wrought on such precious reading material, when she'd first heard the sign of trouble. Luffy. She looks up at the loud roar, wondering at first what kind of animal could produce such a sound. She folds the paper neatly lengthwise then crosswise before stuffing it into the pockets of her shorts with utmost care. Luffy. The roar resounds once more, this time sounding much louder than it had been before and managing to scare the avian out of their nests in the trees. She watches as the flock of birds retreat to the sky, which is kind of stupid now that she sees how easily it would be to shoot at least one of them down, but hey, safety in numbers and all that jazz. She belatedly realizes a moment later that the roar isn't an animal sound, but more like the roar of her name. But by then, it's already too late. Luffffffyyyyy. A resounding crack follows soon after the loud roar, which makes her ears ring in dull pain, and she feels something akin to dread settle coldly in her gut when another crack resounds, but much more nearer to the bandits' hideout. Dear Lord, she gasps as she hurries over to the window, only to jerk back in surprise at what she sees. Mother of... She cuts herself short to instinctively duck down, a shiver of utter fear crawling through her veins at the mere gaze of her grandfather's meeting hers. She understands 4 things. Firstly, her Poppy is here. Secondly, there is a clear wreck of trees that have either been uprooted or hacked off through their trunks right behind Poppy. Thirdly, Poppy looks pissed. And lastly, she is most definitely, undeniably beeped. Despite all that, it still doesn't stop a grin from stretching her lips wide. Because Poppy is here after months and there's no restraining the joy from bursting within her chest like fireworks on a beautiful Independence Day. GG Garp-san. She hears the mountain bandits exclaim in unison, and when she musters the balls to peek over the window once more, she sees Dayton and Dogra practically cowering from her grandfather's powerful glower. What, her grandfather snarls out angrily, is my granddaughter doing here? Granddaughter? Dayton stammers out. Garp-san, we don't know anything 'bout a granddaughter, but if you're askin' 'bout Ace then he's out hunting. It's obvious that she's nervous. She's sweating bullets and the provincial accent in her voice is prominent. a common quirk that most overseas workers back in her original world had tended to slip into when they were jittery. I wasn't asking about Ace, her grandfather snaps. I was asking why my granddaughter is over there. He points a meaty finger at her, when she should clearly be in Fuchsia Village. As one, both Dayton and Dogra robotically turn to look up at her, and they gap when they see only her. Tentatively, she waves at them and smiles a sheepish smile. Both pale dramatically and robotically turn to face Garp, who already has both of his arms crossed and is currently glaring down at them with the force of an elderly, high-ranked Marine as he. "What do you scoundrels have to say for yourself before I arrest you?" her grandfather barks. "We didn't know she was your granddaughter," Dogra cries out, before he cowers behind Dayton once he receives the full brunt of Garp's glare. Magra got sick and all the docs in Goa are complete bastards, and I found her in the forest with Monkey, and she had this backpack full of herbs and stuff, so I asked if she could help and she said that she could, so I brought her here." Dogra word vomits it all out. Once he's done, he looks like he might actually vomit, what with how green his face is. "What?" Garp looks a little bit shell-shocked, and then, to make matters worse, Mamoru bursts out from the treetops and lands solidly on the ground before all of them. Dogra shrieks a little. That's the monkey." He's jabbing his index finger at the air to get his point across. Her grandfather drags his attention to Mamoru, who immediately stills at the sight of the foreign human and looks about ready to pounce, what with how his tail keeps swishing back and forth in whip-like motions. She intervenes. Mamoru could possibly get himself killed by her grandfather. "Mamoru, no," she screams out, pushing her upper body past the windowsill to let her voice travel out much louder. It seems as though the physics in this world is willing to work properly for once, because her tiny arms can't possibly hold up most of the weight of her body, and gravity seems to have it bad for her once she realizes just a tad bit too late that she's already slipped out of the window and is currently free falling to the ground. Fortunately for her, she doesn't hit the ground as she'd fearfully expected to. Instead, her body lands safely into something familiarly large and warm that easily cocoons her tiny body, and she doesn't have to open her eyes to know that it's her grandfather who's caught her. She opens her eyes, takes a long look at her outraged expression, and beams brightly at her old man. "Poppy!" she exclaims, grinning from ear to ear, before she wraps her tiny arms around his thick neck and clings on for life. "I missed you," she cries out, the sound of her heart beating loudly in her ears from having experienced falling out of the goddamn window. Her grandfather's large palm easily cradles the back of her head, and she feels his heavy sigh blowing several strands of her hair. "Yeah, I missed you too," he murmurs as he strokes her head. And, just like always, the mere presence of his arms wrapped around her is enough to uncoil all the tension in her little body that she hadn't been aware of until now. She sighs softly into her grandfather's shoulder, feeling the blood coursing through her veins sing with joy, and she fully closes her eyes, completely content. However, just as she's about to slip off into La La Land, Garp unlatches her from him and holds her body up in the air for him to scrutinize. She blinks drowsily a few times, the fog in her mind heavy, and she yawns sleepily. "You have blood on your clothes," Garp notes, and his words vaguely register in her head. She looks down at herself and sees that yes, there is blood on her clothes. Most specifically, she has tiger blood on her clothes. "And you're injured too," her grandfather says as his gaze takes in every bruise, scratch, cut and gash visible on her. She winces at that, knowing that her adventure in that horrid jungle has cost her several wounds that would probably take weeks to heal. She's just lucky she hadn't broken any bone, or else she'd have probably been mauled to death early on. "And you're not in Fuchsia," Garp states the obvious, and she flinches at the accusation in his voice. "What are you doing here, Luffy?" he asks, his voice even and calm, but his eyes are a different story and showcase an inferno blazing wildly. It's the only thing that comes out of her mouth, and she snaps her mouth shut, promptly mollified and terrified out of her wits. She gazes mournfully at the ground instead, feeling the telltale pricks of tears behind her eyes, and keeps dutifully silent. She feels Garp's heavy gaze boring holes into her head, and she practically feels the disappointment rolling off of him in waves. "Fine," Garp huffs. "If you don't want to talk, then I might as well bring you back to Fuchsia now," he snaps, irritation evident in his voice. She feels panic flicker weakly in her chest before it ignites and courses through her entire being like some kind of fast-acting poison. "No," she cries out, And she's not struggling in Garp's iron grip for herself. She's struggling for the man suffering on the bed upstairs. If she doesn't do something now, then she might as well sign off Magra as beeped and dead. We can't. Magra's sick, and if we don't bring him to Fuchsia then he might die. Are you hearing what you're saying, Luffy? Garp yells at her, and she freezes because he has never yelled at her. Do you know how much trouble you've caused for all the villagers in Fuchsia village? He demands. Running away in the middle of the night to what? Play hero. Especially when Melissa's sick, and everyone else is already struggling to do what they can for her? The grip he has on her arm isn't painful, not in the slightest, but it's the way his hands vibrate against her that tells her he's restraining himself from actually hurting her. You're a kid, Luffy. A kid. If you think this is all a game, then you're wrong because you could have died in here, and I wouldn't have even known if Whoop Slap hadn't called me and told me that you were just gone. He bellows out loudly. And now you want to bring back a bandit cause you think a little flu's going to kill him? Something goes snap inside of her, and she just loses it. Kid, 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 that's all you ever think I am. She screams, beating wildly against his fists, completely outraged at Garp. You think that I don't know this isn't all a game? Exclamation mark. You think that I'm just playing hero for fun. You think that I don't know that Mistress Melissa isn't going to die. I'm not stupid. I know what I'm doing. She shrieks, resorting to digging her fingernails into Garp's fist and raking it down. Melissa Obaa is going to die if I don't give her the herbs she'll need. Magra is going to die if I don't give him the proper medication. Don't tell me I don't know what I'm doing when I've read and know exactly what I'm doing. She doesn't realize she's been crying hysterically until she feels herself being placed on a flat surface so that the big, meaty hands that had been firmly holding her are now wiping away the tears streaming down her cheeks. A watery hiccup slips past her lips. I don't even want to be a hero, she sobs out. I didn't even want to leave home, but I had to because I knew how to help Melissa Obaa, and if I couldn't help her then who would? Her voice cracks towards the end, and it's not a pretty sound at all. Stupid girl. Garp huffs, but his voice is softer and much gentler compared to the furious one he'd used a while ago, and her brain instinctively switches his designation to grandfather. Kokoi's a doctor and he knows what he's doing, he tells her as he wipes the tears from her cheeks with his meaty thumbs. She adamantly shakes her head, breathing in deeply a few times to recompose herself. No, Poppy, he doesn't, she denies. Everybody keeps on saying that there's something wrong with Melissa Obaa's lungs, but they're wrong. She insists. It's her heart that's wrong. Her heart. Her grandfather doesn't look like he believes her one bit. Now, Luffy, you can't possibly know that, he says, and it breaks her because she does. I've read about it, she stubbornly persists, reining in her temper because it'd just be a waste of time and angry tears to have another tantrum, before she's pulling out the pages she'd ripped off of Kokoi's books and rattling on about the symptoms she'd noticed and pointing out all the herbs she'd collected to help relieve the mistress of Party's bar's pain. When she's finally said her part, she determinedly meets her grandfather's gaze. I know what I'm doing, she states with firm resolution, and the feeling of something powerful coils tight just right next to her heart, and it coils and coils and coils until it stops, practically vibrating in anticipation. She expects the feeling to explode any minute now, only, disappointingly, it deflates like a popped air balloon, leaving only emptiness in its wake. Distractedly, she looks at her chest and puts a hand over it, caressing the sudden ache that had popped out of nowhere. What just happened? She puzzles over the sudden sensation for a few more moments before the sound of her grandfather's heavy sigh catches her attention once more. And her grandfather looks tired. For once in his life, he looks like he's actually the 61-year-old that he is, and she wonders what has made him look as if the weight of the world had fallen atop his shoulders. I'll tell my crew's doctor to come check up on the bandit, her grandfather passes judgment, and her eyes widen at his surprising kindness and generosity after she'd thrown such a fit. In exchange, you come back home with me to Fuchsia village. Ah, so he's bartering with her. It takes her a full minute of staring at him in stunned surprise, because she hadn't expected him to think so cleverly, before her brain can actually process his words. There's nothing wrong with his offer, in fact, it weighs more towards her side in terms of advantages, and she'd be a fool to not accept. She looks back at Dogra and Dayton, who had fearfully retreated into the safe premises of the house and are now peeking at them from the first-floor windows, and she steels herself before looking up at her grandfather. "Promise they'll help Magra?" she asks, and it's the only thing she's ever asked of him besides extending his vacation a little longer so that they have just a little more time together, and sending shitty, photocopied letters to her. She doesn't ask a lot from him, because she's tired of having her expectations for anybody be such a disappointment to her when they can't live up to it. He can't return her father, after all. Yes, he answers. And that is enough for her. Okay. Beep. Mamoru clings to her back with his tail wrapped protectively around her upper arm. He's been shooting dagger looks at her grandfather for a while as they walk down a rough trail leading back to Fuchsia village, and he's been prone to baring his sharp canines at the elder marine. She is too appalled with herself to admonish her partner. "Aye," Mamoru screeches lowly, threateningly, as he peers up at Garp from behind her head. She flicks her gaze to him, and presses her lips together as she does her best to give him the look to get him to stop. Mamoru merely eyes her as if she's the crazy one. "Nice friend you've got there," her grandfather remarks. He's been making small talk since they've left the mountain bandits' hideout, and her silence doesn't discourage him in the least. Instead, he just keeps on talking. "I remember this baby tiger I used to lug around when I was your age. We'd go hunt together every day and go on adventures." Was she supposed to reply to that? It sounded like she should, but she doesn't really want to say anything to him. She'd rather let herself wallow in shame at her tantrum for a bit longer because that hadn't been mature of her, which she should have been. But no, instead, she had chosen the path of pettiness because she'd panicked and decided that screaming her head off would be the better route than talking things out like civilized adults would have done. Something large and heavy patting her head snaps her out of her thoughts, but it disappears soon enough when she hears Mamoru hiss out angrily. "Feisty too," Garp adds, shooting her a bright grin. Her chest tightens painfully, and she stops walking, which makes Garp stop walking as well. He ignores the befuddled look on his face as she stares up at him. Not for the first time in this life, she considers how lucky she is to have a grandfather as, well, not exactly uncaring per se since she knows he does care for her, but maybe extremely lenient. In her first life she would have gotten the cold shoulder for days after a harsh scolding that usually brought out the hanger if she'd ever thrown a fit like that. And she feels herself tear up at how self-centered and tactless she'd been. Moving closer to him so that she is capable of wrapping as much as her little arms can around his thick leg, she squeezes him tightly and grumbles out regretfully, "I'm sorry, Poppy." Her grandfather laughs and pats her on the head, uncaring of Mamoru's hiss and the daring swipe to his hand. "I forgive you," he tells her. "But you should apologize to your Maki-no-ne and that whoop slap too. Your disappearance made them go crackers," he added. "Crackers? Was that old people speak for something? Just don't go running off like that again, okay?" he asks of her. She puffs her cheeks. "I left a note," she insists, but shrinks into herself when Garp's eyes narrow. "And it's the worst note I've ever read," he snorts. "Look, Luffy. You went into Mount Kalubo without any fighting experience and that was wrong of you because you could have died," he scolds her. "You're lucky you only got out with some wounds." "But I wanted to help Melissa," she murmurs. "Yeah, well, Melissa would have wanted you alive more," he retorts, and she fruitlessly wilts at the truth. "Now come on. We're wasting daylight here and the faster we get back to Fuchsia, the faster you can get a bath." Eventually, they stumble out of the famous Mount Kalubo, and she's forced to say goodbye to Mamoru who'd stubbornly clung to a tree as if being separated from the jungle itself had physically pained him. "I'll come back," she promises as she caresses his head. "I'll come back and look for you, so just wait for me, okay?" "Ooh," Mamoru whimpers, his tail tightening around her arm for a brief moment before it reluctantly uncurls and retreats back to his side. He looks into her eyes, trying one more time to persuade her to stay, before he gives up upon seeing the large human lift the little girl into his arms. He bares his teeth at Garp one last time before he swiftly turns around and climbs up the tree to the safety of the treetops. Saying goodbye hurts the most, but it has to be done. "Bye-bye, Mamoru," she calls out as her grandfather brings her away from the forest, waving for as long as the tree her friend had hidden within is visible to her. Beep. "You are never going out again," Makino swears passionately as she squeezes her tightly to the point of pain. "I will strap you down to my chest if I have to so that you will never have to go anywhere again," the barmaid vows with a hoarse voice as she buries her face into Luffy's greasy hair. "I'm sorry, Makino-ne," She whimpers as she grasps onto the back of Makino's clothes as strongly as she can. I won't do it again. I promise, she says through the tears streaming down her cheeks for the second time that day. You better, Makino sniffs, pulling away and revealing her tear-stained face. You had me and everyone else so worried, Luffy. We thought you'd been kidnapped, she exclaims. Do you know what I felt like when I found out that you were gone? I was so scared, because something could have happened to you and I couldn't be there to protect you. So don't you ever do that again. You hear me? She half demands, half sobs before she's pulling her back into her chest for another breathless hug. I won't do it again, Makino nay, she cries back. After a while, when Makino has been sated with having had her to herself for a whole 10 minutes, the barmaid reluctantly allows the young girl to be spirited off away for the other villagers to fret over and hug. You had us all worried, Luffy. We searched everywhere for you, but you weren't there. We thought we'd never get you back. Are you all right, dear? You're covered in wounds. I'm just glad that you came back to us. Did you even eat out there? Hey, somebody get her something to eat. She might have not eaten anything in a week. Don't go running off like that again, okay? You gave your poor Makino nay and whoop slap OJII heart attacks. And it is all just too much for her. Because what has she ever done in any of her lives to deserve such love and affection? It fills herself up in the best and worst ways possible, something that alcohol could never be compared to, and it leaves her in a cocoon of warmth and completeness, and of a kind of guilt that eats away at her insides for making everyone cry despite their large smiles. Everyone, she hiccups wetly, biting down on her bottom lip as she tearfully looks up at everyone who had been waiting for her to return, and trying her very best to bottle up the powerful emotions raging inside of her. I'm so sorry, she wails, sobs, cries, howls, screams, and everything comes out of her through those 3 words. Stupid brat. Whoop slap yells, hitting her none too gently at the back of her head with his blunt cane. Just don't do that again, you hear me? I'm too old for these kinds of shenanigans. And what I tell the rest of you folks. A monkey is always a monkey, he complains, throwing his arms up. And everybody guffaws at Whoop Slap, who smirks. But Luffy's having none of that. I'm sorry, Gigi, she hiccups as she clings to Whoop Slap's pants. Whoop Slap looks down at her, gives her the stink eye, fails after a minute, and proceeds to promptly muss her hair up even more. You were supposed to be the quiet one, he sighs, as if the world had just lost something to stabilize it. When he slips her a piece of hard candy, she knows she's forgiven and squeezes his leg one more time before making her way to the rest of the villagers to apologize. Saving the best for last, she walks over to Kokoi and Sharon where they're seated by the bar. As butterflies fly around in her stomach, she notices that Sharon has her hand over her bloated stomach with a look of discomfort on her face. You're never knocking me up again, Sharon complains. I'm serious, I miss seeing my feet again, she says as she glowers darkly at her laughing husband. Well, your due date's next week, so you'll be able to see them soon enough. Kokoi beams brightly, making his wife sigh in exasperation. She, on the other hand, wonders if Sharon's going to give birth to twins, maybe triplets, because she looks like her womb is housing more than just a single baby. Kokoi Oji, Sharon nay, she calls, catching the young couple's attentions. As Kokoi points at himself and mouths, Kokoi Oji, with a shattered look on his face, Sharon smiles warmly at her. Hi there, Luffy, she greets, before her smile turns sinister. You had me worried when I found out you just up and left. Don't you ever do that again, okay? I had a hard time sleeping 'cause I kept thinking what had happened to you. The young woman scolds her, reaching down to pinch her cheek with a strong grip. OOOWWWW, she moans. Sharon nay, stoop, she whines. Just don't do it again, okay? Sharon threatens, letting go. I can't have my kid's older sister in trouble. Her eyes pop wide open, and she looks up at Sharon in astonishment. Oh, older sister, she stammers out, voice pitching high towards the end, and Sharon nods as if she hadn't just broken some big news. Of course. Sharon huffs. You're practically my kid already, and you'd make a good big sister, I'm sure. Call it a woman's intuition, the young woman winks knowingly at her. She's honestly speechless. You be good to them, okay? Sharon asks, smiling amiably. Love them as much as I love you, okay? She giggles. Feeling tears prick at the back of her eyes for the third beeping time today, she nods determinedly. I will. She promises. I'll be the best big sister ever. Sharon just continues smiling brightly at her, but her dark eyes have certainly softened to a degree that expresses her affection for the little girl. I'm sure you will, she replies wholeheartedly. Ah, you're blushing, Kokoi teases, pulling over to pinch her other cheek and making her blush even harder. When Kokoi pulls his hand away before she could probably bite it, she remembers why she even came to them in the first place. Ah, Kokoi Oji, I stole something from you, she confesses, gaze straying to the ground in shame. Here, she hands over the pages she'd stolen that had stayed folded up in her pockets. These are, Kokoi trails off, eyes widening. Are these my notes? He asks, and his voice is strangely high-pitched as he stares in utter devastation at his work. She winces. Yes. I ripped them off, she mumbles the last part. But I'll put them back, she promises. Kokoi doesn't reply, having transformed into a statue as he stares expressionlessly down at the pages. How will you do that? Sharon asks, amused. I can sew them back, she answers confidently. Do you even know how to sew? Sharon points out. I'll ask Makino-ne to teach me, then I'll sew them back, she vows. She'd seen her younger sister in her past life replace the springs in their notebooks with yarn, and she remembers some of the process, so with a little refresher with Makino she's sure she'll be able to accomplish the feat. Well, you go do that while I take care of. Sharon stops talking then, and places a hand on her bulging stomach. Hush, hush now. Kicking hurts mommy too, you know, the young woman murmurs sweetly, gently. And then what sounds like a pop goes off, and Luffy freezes because this is all starting to resemble when her younger sister had gone into beeping labor. Oh my, Sharon gasps after a while as she gets off of the stool that is now alarmingly wet. Oh my god, she says. Honey, I think my water broke, she shakes Kokoi who seems to have snapped out of his trance at the keywords. What? Kokoi turns to her almost thoughtlessly, most likely going into shock. She can't blame him. She's going into shock, I said, Sharon says calmly. I think my water broke. The bar has never felt any quieter as those 5 life-shattering words bounce off the walls of the bar. Robotically, everybody turns to Sharon who has already crossed her arms and is now impatiently tapping her foot. Chaos descends soon enough when the only doctor in the village falls to a dead faint. Beep. As the adults fret over the young woman in labor, Garp herds her over to the second floor and she manages to find it in herself to stubbornly stick to the ground right in front of Melissa's door. She knows, Garp says simply, making her heart plummet down to her gut. Balling her hands into tiny fists, she stares straight at the door. Go. Garp prods with his foot, but it's enough to send her toppling forward and smacking face first into the door. And, as if common sense doesn't exist in the face of anime logic, the door miraculously opens despite there being a doorknob that has to be twisted first. She lands sprawled on the ground and her face flushes in embarrassment at her grandfather's laughter in the background. So noisy. Melissa complains from where she's seated up on her bed, her voice worryingly hoarse. And reacting so barbarically when a little lady falls. I should beat you black and blue if I could only get up, Melissa snarls, before she picks up the glass by her bedside table and promptly chucks it at Garp. Amazingly enough, her grandfather catches the glass without even having to beeping look at it. And you little brat, Melissa addresses her with a snippy voice. Just what are you doing on the ground? Get up, girls don't belong on the floor. Why yes, mistress, she obeys as she immediately gets off of the ground and pats any dirt that had accumulated on her clothes. Come here, Melissa beckons with a hand. Let me see your face, the elderly woman orders, and she's quick to comply. Grasping Luffy's chin in her wrinkled hand, Melissa scrutinizes the state her youngest charge had landed herself into. I heard you went off to get yourself dirty, Melissa mentions nonchalantly as if she's talking about the weather. She cringes. Give us some privacy, Garp, Melissa asks for. Don't go breaking my granddaughter, Garp calls out as he slams the door shut. Melissa just smiles eerily as she looks down at her. But I already did. Nay? Melissa asks, tilting her head in what would have been cute if she was half her age but just now looks scary. Yes, she answers, nodding dutifully. I'm more of Melissa Obeye's granddaughter than crazy old Poppy, she recites perfectly, knowing what to say to appease the old woman. Melissa grins, looking like the cat that had devoured the canary right after plucking its wings. That's correct, she purrs. Now, what's all this crap I've been hearing from Whoop Slap about you running away and fixing things? She asks, straight to the point. She looks down at the ground and pettily kicks her foot. I just wanted to help you, she answers. By what? By getting yourself into trouble. Melissa snaps. Where on earth did you even run off to anyways? And raise your chin. Ladies aren't afraid of holding their heads high, she admonishes. Reluctantly complying with Melissa's orders, she lifts her chin up and looks straight at Melissa's eyes. Her throat tightens. I went to Mount Kalubo to get some herbs that Kokoi Oji didn't have in his clinic. Melissa's eyes widen. Mount Kalubo? She utters, before her hands go everywhere on the young girl's body. You're not hurt, are you? She asks, and freezes when she finally takes heed of the blood on Luffy's clothes that she'd foolishly mistaken for as dried mud. Where did this blood come from, Luffy? She asks, voice blank. A tiger, she answers after a hefty amount of silence. A tiger, Melissa intones blandly. She nods wordlessly. Poseidon, the old woman breathes out. You monkeys and your fascination with anything that can kill you, she scowls. And how did you get out of that mess, huh? Melissa asks. Mamoru, a monkey I befriended, saved me, she answers, smiling fondly and a little sadly at the remembrance of the primate. First a tiger, then a monkey. Don't tell me there's a snake in that story too, Melissa huffs out. At Luffy's silence, Melissa eyes the little girl suspiciously. There's a snake, isn't there? Melissa asks sourly. Yes. It tried to eat me, but Mamoru saved me from that too, and I gave him food in exchange and he brought me to his little monkey tribe after that, she explains. Melissa stares at her. You are never going out again, Melissa decides. Never, and I'll chain you to my bed if I have to myself. She smiles up at her guardian. That's what Makino Ne told me too, she informs Melissa, who sighs. Why did you even go there, Luffy? You could have gotten yourself killed. Because I wanted to help you, Melissa Obaa, she answers, reaching out to hold onto the elderly woman's sleeve because she doesn't have the courage to actually hold her hand. I don't want you to leave yet, she admits, her gaze straying to the ground. Melissa sighs a deeper sigh this time. Oh, Luffy, she says, old and wise, as if she knows all the secrets to the world. Come here, Melissa pats the spot on the bed beside her, and she complies willingly. Melissa breathes in deeply, readying herself for the words that she has to impart. Everybody has to go someday, she starts out softly, and I know you've always been smart enough to understand this. That eventually, nature will take its toll on you, or the devil itself finally decides that your luck has run out and you have to pay what you owe, and you'll have to pass on, she says wistfully. And I'd rather pick an old woman like me who's already past her prime to kick the bucket than a 2-year-old girl who has yet to live her life yet. Don't say that, she protests with a wobbly voice. You have your whole life ahead of you, Luffy, Melissa says softly, caressing the little girl's cheek with fondness twinkling in her eyes. So don't waste it for an old woman like me. But what if I want to? She replies. Don't, Melissa snaps, voice as sharp as her eyes are, and she pulls her hand away. I appreciate the gesture really, but, Melissa stops, then looks down at her wrinkled hands with tired eyes. I only regret not being able to live long enough to be there for you and Makino. I'd have liked to at least watch the both of you bloom, she admits remorsefully instead. It takes her a minute for Melissa's words to settle in her head. You want to die, she says, accusation practically dripping from her tongue, and she feels betrayed and hurt, but the emotions disappear soon enough when she realizes why. You're tired, she voices out, and her chest tightens in sympathetic pain. I knew you've always been too smart for your own good, Melissa sighs, but the corners of her lips twitch upwards. Avant would have loved you and Makino, the old woman confesses, her eyes glossy with tears. And I believe I've kept him waiting for far too long. Her throat tightens and she bites her bottom lip. Scooting closer to Melissa, she throws her arms as gently as she can around the old woman and gives her a big hug. I love you, she says before she loses the chance to ever say it. Despite her words being muffled into the old woman's stomach, Melissa understands it all the same. I love you too, she shares, stroking her hair fondly. Beep. She sits outside on the porch steps with heavy thoughts. A part of her brain is berating her for at least not telling Melissa the truth. About her, about everything. But the other part is telling her that she shouldn't because despite everything, she's still a scaredy cat deep down, and it also wouldn't be fair to push the burden upon her shoulders to somebody who's barely hanging onto the thread of life they have left. She's really good at making excuses, she muses to herself as she finger combs her damp hair. The bath had been amazing, and she's never loved brushing her teeth after a week of nothing but the taste of morning breath in her mouth. Her attention is immediately captured by her grandfather walking up the hill to their small abode with an admittedly handsome brunette Marine walking alongside him. She watches with curious eyes as they both stop, exchanging several words that are too far to reach her ears, before the younger Marine salutes Garp sharply and turns on his heel to leave. Garp easily spots her waiting. "Ah, Luffy," he calls, grinning. "I've got good news for you. Apparently that bandit of Dayton's will survive," he informs her, and it feels as if some weight has been lifted off of her chest. She smiles in relief. At least something good came out of today. "Will Sharon be okay?" she inquires to her grandfather. "It's been over 10 hours already, and the sun has already set hours ago. Usually, the birthing process would have been over by now unless there was a problem." Oh, the lass is still giving birth last I heard. But she's popping another one, so it's to be expected," he comments as if he was talking about the weather. She pauses. Another? Could it be? Had her joking assessment been correct? Yeah. Apparently she's having twins. The first's a girl by the way, and isn't that great? "You'll have a playmate now," Garp says. Holy beep, she thinks. Poor Sharon. One baby was hard enough, but two twins were tricky to have, and it isn't uncommon for at least one of them not surviving. "Don't worry your pretty little head, Luffy," Garp says, patting her head with enough strength to make her neck ache. All women in Fuchsia are made of tougher material than others outside. Melissa made sure of that. Bawahahaha, he bellows out a laugh. She would have let out a laugh as well since her grandfather's joy is infectious, but she can't really find it in her to smile anymore at the mention of Melissa. Noticing her low spirits, Garp's laughter ends in an awkward note. "What's wrong? You worried about Melissa? Hey, that old hag will push through like always, just you wait and see." Flicking her gaze upwards, she looks up at Garp, no hint of any hope on her face. She appreciates the gesture, but the lie Garp has woven to comfort her does the exact opposite. "She won't," she sighs out. "You don't have to lie to me, Poppy. I know what's going to happen to her," she tells her grandfather. An awkward silence blankets the air above them, and she looks sadly down at the ground. Her attention is brought back to her grandfather when she hears the wood from underneath groan in protest as he plops down right beside her. She has enough time to look up at him in confusion before she's suddenly being lifted by her armpits and brought close to a broad, muscular chest. She squawks, "Hey!" Garp silences her soon enough by placing a hand on the back of her head whilst his other arm is settled comfortably around her back to prevent her from escaping. Sometimes, her grandfather starts, voice gravelly and thick with emotion. "I wish you'd gotten your brains from me," he discloses to her. "Then maybe you wouldn't have to think like that." She stiffens at his words, heart jumping into her throat, as does does he know circles around her head like a headless chicken. "Breathe," she tells herself. "Breathe. You know too much for your age," Garp murmurs. "And it worries me that you'll grow up too soon, like your father," he admits, grip on her tightening just a bit as if afraid she'll slip out and disappear on him. At his words, her heart promptly dislodges itself from her throat and drops down to land in her stomach with a pitiful cracking sound. The stiffness in her muscles is now for an entirely different reason, and her throat constricts tightly at her grandfather's mention of her father. He hasn't once mentioned Dragon since he'd brought her here. "So stay a kid, even just for a little longer," Garp orders her, voice soft and not all that commanding, as he eases his grip on her so that she has enough space to look up at him. What she sees breaks her heart. She clenches his clothes with her tiny fists. "I have your heart," she says instead, because she can't promise him anything, not when there's an elderly woman slowly rotting away in bed, not when there's a lonely, 5-year-old boy in Mount Kalubo. Not when there are people who deserves better, not when there's an entire world out there that needs fixing. Garp smiles wryly. "But your will is your will," he sighs, as if that changes everything. His words are cryptic, but she doesn't let herself ponder over them as she lays her head upon his chest and listens to the rhythmic beat of his heart. I love you, Poppy. I love you too, Luffy, beep. Later on, when she's wrapped into a burrito with her blankets and listening to her grandfather snore loudly in between irritated mutters and jovial bwahahahahs, it occurs to her. Since her grandfather loves her, then maybe, just maybe, he might have loved her father in a time now lost. The very thought eludes her, but that's nothing new. Her mind's been boggled probably 1,000 times since she died and woken up in the body of a newborn infant. She slips back into sleep soon enough, or maybe he still does. Beep. Kokoi lifts her high enough for her to see the two babies nestled together like two peas in a pod within their shared crib. Both are swathed in white blankets with ducks on them, and the only way they can be told apart is from the color of the ducks. Marie's our eldest. Kokoi beams with fatherly pride at the little tyke wrapped in the blanket with pink ducks. And Varrick's our youngest. He coos softly at the one with blue ducks all over his blanket. Like all newborn infants, the twins have the same scrunched-up features, which makes them look like rosy-faced, humanoid pugs. If they hadn't been born as fraternal twins, then the newly fledged parents would have most likely had a hard time distinguishing one from the other. It's fortunate that the twins had survived, even more so that Sharon had come out of it safe and sound after an 18-hour nap and a few stitches down there, considering that it had been her first pregnancy and all. They're cute, she comments, and she means it. If that crib had any space for her, she would have demanded to be placed in it to snooze next to her new siblings, but alas, the crib had only been made with one baby in mind and two was already quite a squeeze. They are, aren't they? Kokoi muses, reaching down with one hand to caress his daughter's head before doing the same to his son's cheek. I'm glad they came out healthy, he sighs out in relief. Be a child, be a child, be a child, she chants in her head. When can they run? She asks curiously. Kokoi looks down at her with what seems like alarm. Run. Oh, Luffy, he chides in a soft voice, and she swallows down whatever distaste she feels at being treated like a child. They're barely a week old. They won't be running until they're 3, unlike you, 'cause your craziness is just one of a kind, he snorts. Monkey, she says, as if it's the answer to everything so weird about her. And it honestly is in a small, normal village like Fuchsia. As Kokoi drones on about her being a good example to his children, she stares softly down at the snoozing infants. She's been a big sister before, surely, she can actually be a good one this time around. Beep. A week after Garp leaves to attend to his naval duties, Melissa finally finds her peace on a beautiful, windy afternoon. Nobody knows how exactly did she pass away. Was it an attack that had burned her heart so painfully to the point that breathing had become an impossible feat? Or did she simply slip off into an eternal sleep without knowing it herself? But nobody dwells on it, too lost in their own mourning. Makino does not push her away to drown in her own sorrow and despair over such an unfortunate event as she'd done so before. Instead, the young woman brings her close to her chest and weeps with all of her heart. She too sheds tears, the kind that she'll never be ashamed of and will instead hold close to her heart for the sole reason that it had been for someone worth the pain, and sobs into Makino's blouse until she leaves it wet and covered in snot. They don't cry prettily, but it doesn't matter because unlike sappy romance novels where every character has to be perfect, theirs is raw and thick with true, human emotion. After all, there is nothing more beautiful and hideous than humanity itself at its truest form. I won't leave you alone again, Makino whispers to her hair, pressing soft beepies every now and then, as if her very presence is a necessary comfort to the young woman. It most likely is, for Makino is her only anchor to reality right now as well. We'll get through this together, Makino murmurs, requests, suggests, or maybe even promises because she's kind like that. She nods wordlessly and clamps tight onto Makino's blouse. Beep. Melissa's burial is held 3 days later, on a day as windy and beautiful as the one she'd passed away on. Melissa is dressed in her finest robes, with her hair twisted into an ornate braid and whatever jewelry she owned draped across her. She looks so peaceful from within the cushions of the wooden coffin her physical body is doomed to stay in for the rest of time, as if she's merely taking one of her naps. But everybody knows better than to assume so. Every single resident of Fuchsia village attends the funeral, each one dressed modestly in their dully colored mourning clothes. Neither prayers nor songs are sung for the deceased in their culture. Instead, Theirs is much simpler and more personal. Once Melissa's coffin has been covered and laid down to rest within the deep hole made for it, Whoop Slap steps forward with a bouquet of marigolds and blue periwinkles. "Rest in peace, friend," are the only words he imparts before he tosses the bouquet into the hole. And so the proceedings continue on as thus, with each one of them imparting their own final words to the elderly mistress of the bar and tossing their bouquets to the grave. And she watches them all dutifully, watches the proof that Melissa had died loved, with a cold type of numbness coursing through her veins. When it's only her and Makino who are the only ones left, she untangles her fingers from Makino's and lets the young woman step forward. Makino stands over the unburied grave, holding what is indubitably the most beautiful bouquet that has yet to be delivered to Melissa. "Mistress," Makino utters, voice the gentlest and most loving it has ever been. "You taught me everything I know, and even though you were harsh and mean and strict," she pauses to wipe a stray tear that had leaked from the corner of one of her eyes. "I can't thank you enough for everything, because if it weren't for you, then I would probably have been even more helpless and clumsier than I am now," she laughs wetly. "You took me in when you could have left me alone, treated me with love when you could have easily abused me, and became my mother when you didn't have to." Makino swallows down the sob that threatens to creep up her throat. "And for all that, I will never forget you." She tosses the bouquet of honeybeetles, "Proof of our love, dahlias, my gratitude exceeds your care, pink carnations, you shall remain in my memories for eternity, and wood sorrels, maternal tenderness," into the pit. Makino turns back, with her bottom lip clenched tightly in between her teeth, but she makes her way back with her head held high, looking every bit the strong woman Melissa had beaten into her. She realizes she's ironically the only one left, and she makes her way to the forefront of Melissa's open grave underneath everyone's watchful eyes. She licks her lips, swallows down the lump in her throat, and says, "I'm sorry. For causing you trouble, for not being able to help you, and for keeping secrets from you even until you died. Thank you for everything, Melissa Obaa. For loving me. For loving Makino Ne. For loving everybody. For choosing me over you, most of all. I hope that you've been able to find the peace you wanted, unlike me." She throws her bouquet of flaxes and Michaelmas daisies, in spoken words of the kindness she'd felt and the farewells that were forced, to join the rest and returns to Makino's side without so much as another peep. She watches as the men start to fill in Melissa's grave, feeling even colder and emptier than before. She and Makino stay past sunset, sitting down on the grass and cattails before Melissa's grave, and holding one another's hands as they stew in somber silence. They only come home once the sun has set and the moon has risen. Back home to a house that will never feel the same again. To be continued, and thanks for watching.